American Secession by F.H. Buckley, The Looming Threat of a National Breakup.
Hey everyone, before we continue on, I just want to remind you, if you haven't done so already, hit that subscribe button, hit the thumbs up icon, and as always, please leave your comments. I'd love to hear from you. Now, here's the chapter. Buckley talks about how at different times in the United States of America, we came close to breaking up. There's two very significant moments. In the Philadelphia Convention of 1789, there was a lot of debate related to the Constitution and whether or not it could be ratified. And this particular chapter goes into that in detail as it relates to the philosophical underpinnings of the debate and the key players that were involved in that debate here in America. There were compromises that were made, and it was settled that it wasn't pretty much one or the other, but a blend of philosophies that came together. So the two times that it didn't almost work out was 1787, as I mentioned, and of course the big breakdown, which was the War for Secession in 1860-61, the Civil War, the War of Northern Aggression, the War between the states, whatever you want to call it. There's a number of different names for it. Buckley talks about how, and in fact I can quote it here, just too damn big, and that by population, the top three countries in the world, China, India, and the US, have some real issues related to their bigness. China's a kind of an odd case because we can't really talk about it breaking up because it's a totalitarian police state. So the people there, unfortunately, are trapped by their government. So there's no breaking away. There's no advocating for rights. In fact, we're even wondering if there's going to be acquisition of land by China in places that are currently, experiencing some challenges there. Um, the second country in terms of population is, of course, India, and India was in fact broken at its founding into Pakistan, uh, basically based on religious lines, Hinduism and Islam. And then, of course, we have the United States, which is not only the contiguous 48 states, but two states that are not geographically limited to land, the assorted territories in the Pacific and in Puerto Rico and the Virgin Islands. There's a lot of territory that's covered by the United States. So I guess the question becomes, is the country just too large? Can the people living in American Samoa, do they share the same values as those living in Cambridge, Massachusetts? That's a question that needs to be explored. Now, of the 10 most populous countries in the world, Buckley makes a note of saying that almost all of them have had secession movements, separatist movements, happen within its borders. As far as land goes, land mass goes, America is number 4 in the world. And so the question then becomes, again, how do people that live geographically so far from each other, cultural differences so wide apart, how do they move forward as a people? There's no common ground. At this point in the chapter, Buckley gets into the differentiation of three Enlightenment era philosophers, Hume, Montesquieu, and Rousseau. And he goes into Hume as primarily an advocate of large governments, that large, big governments are a way of protecting rights because the larger the entity, the more protection that minorities in terms of thought would have from being overwhelmed by the mob. It's just too hard to build a coalition. That's kind of like Hume in a nutshell. Montesquieu and Rousseau advocated small governments, and all of their philosophies had some bearing on the actual structure of the United States Constitution as it was being formed. The Montesquieu and the Rousseau idea is that small states are better because the people know each other better. There's more trust between them. They are more vested in their fellow citizens. And he made point of saying that in Montesquieu's book or writings, The Grandeur of Rome in 1734, he noted that Rome was great when it was very small, but as it grew, its troubles increased. And this is a common factor, common identity in a state, in a given state, fades with size as the country grows. So those are some three sort of currents that are running in terms of philosophy related to the size of government. And what's interesting is Buckley gets into a discussion about the Constitution. And it's here that I actually was quite surprised by something. I've always been a big fan of James Madison as the father of the Constitution. He had a lot of wisdom to add, and certainly what I was taught in school, I've always come to admire him. But I think looking at how the United States turned out, a lot of what he was advocating for was actually sort of incorrect. And there were other people that were involved in debate that happy their ideas came into fruition. So here's how it went. The framers said that basically the optimal size of a state had some kind of a proper division between federal and state government. So what we had created in the Constitution was a very state-oriented Constitution and very, very limited federal power. However, over the course of time, that has changed. Now, James Madison was a proponent of a larger, powerful, more federal government. And I'll get into what he specifically talked about in a moment. But he also mentioned a man by the name of Roger Sherman, who was very much oriented towards making sure the government was as small as possible and the states held as many rights as possible. Now, Madison agreed with Hume that very much there was a lot of protection for minority groups in a larger governmental structure. He had a lot of critique about the Articles of Confederation at that time and how they weren't working, and that there was a need for a stronger federal government. His main idea was that the majority would always oppress a minority, and in a larger state, that becomes less of a factor. Whether or not he's right, I guess we're finding out. Whereas Roger Sherman said that people of Connecticut, he said that basically people are more happy in small rather than large states. And so there was a large debate over that. And Madison got his way in some cases, but did not get his way in others. And the big point to be made here is that the Madison, and in his defense, many of the people at the Constitutional Convention did feel the same way, that Congress, the people's house, would or could or should elect the president, that there'd be less power in the hands of the people, more in the hands of the representatives that were sent to Congress. Interesting. That one of the proposals were that the federal government could veto state law, and that the Senate would not be designed with smaller states in mind, two senators per state, to protect minority rights, but that the Senate, like the House, would be determined by population. So we know that those things did not happen. Madison did not get his way. By the same token, Roger Sherman didn't get entirely his way either. There were compromises, and the balance that we designed has, as I mentioned before, changed over time, and there's specific reasons why that happened. In the act of actually debating some of these concepts, Governor Morris was advocating for a more separation of powers, which would give the state, move the power from the states to the federal government. This is some of that compromise that we're talking about, that Buckley was talking about. And he really wanted to move that power to the federal government in the way that Madison was advocating for, based on the teachings of the writings of Hume. The separation of powers we're very, very familiar with. And in an ideal world, it is a check on a powerful president. But what has happened is that as the country has gotten more polarized, the president, not able to get things through, is often going to executive orders and is feeling and acting very isolated. And so there is a increasing polarization that happens that's basically a systemic issue, that there is the collaboration between the parties is becoming less and less based on cultural reasons and the political ramifications that are being played out before our very eyes. Buckley ends this chapter by mentioning that a constitution requires agreement of the people on fundamental principles. Say that again. The Constitution requires agreement on fundamental principles between the people. And we're finding that is increasingly less and less. And so that ends the chapter. That is the summary, and we'll leave it there for today.